April 8th, 1943, 27,000 feet above Caen, France. German fighter ace Oberleutnant Ralph Hermeken couldn't suppress his laughter as he watched the massive American fighters struggling to climb toward his formation. The new Republic P-47 Thunderbolts looked almost comical to pilots accustomed to sleek Spitfires and nimble Messerschmitts. Hermeken transmitted to his wingman, "The Americans have sent us flying milk bottles. These corpulent machines with their barrel-shaped fuselages and greenhouse canopies seemed more like targets than threats." Within 18 months, those same milk bottles would become instruments of terror. Not in the skies, where German pilots first encountered them, but on the ground, where they would systematically destroy the Wehrmacht's ability to wage war. The P-47 Thunderbolt entered combat as a high-altitude interceptor, and the Germans initially dismissed it as too heavy, too slow to turn, and too ungainly to pose a serious threat. At 10,000 pounds empty weight, it was the largest single-engine fighter of the war. Luftwaffe pilots called them Indiana, fat targets pretending to be warriors. After early encounters in 1943, Hauptmann Josef Priller of Jagdgeschwader 26 reported to headquarters, "The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow." But what German intelligence failed to recognize was that the Thunderbolt wasn't designed to fight like a European fighter. It was designed around American industrial philosophy: overwhelming firepower, extreme durability, and mass production. The aircraft that German pilots mocked would soon become their worst nightmare, not in aerial combat, but in a role no one had anticipated. The transformation began in early 1944, when Allied planners realized they needed to prepare for the invasion of France. General Dwight Eisenhower wanted German lines of communication destroyed, their transportation networks crippled, and their ground forces unable to maneuver. The P-51 Mustang, despite its fame as an escort fighter, had a vulnerable liquid-cooled engine with a belly-mounted radiator that couldn't survive low-altitude ground attack missions. But the P-47, with its massive air-cooled radial engine, could absorb punishment that would destroy any other aircraft. In March 1944, Major Glenn Duncan of the 353rd Fighter Group pioneered using the Thunderbolt for low-level strafing and dive bombing. The results were immediately promising. The aircraft's .850 caliber Browning machine guns could fire 3,400 rounds of ammunition at a combined rate of 6,000 rounds per minute. A 3-second burst put 23 pounds of bullets into a target area the size of a truck. That's 75 2-ounce slugs, lethal from 4 miles away. The sheer recoil typically slowed the P-47 20 to 30 miles per hour during firing. The Germans had no idea what was coming. They had fought Allied aircraft for years and developed effective defensive measures. Camouflage, dispersion, anti-aircraft guns, and nighttime movement had all proven successful against previous threats. But the Thunderbolt was different. Its great strength and ground attack came from its fearsome diving speed. Plunging from 15,000 feet with a weapon release at 10,000 feet, Thunderbolt pilots avoided the worst of the flak and retained plenty of room to pull out. If the P-47 could be made to pull out at 0 altitude, it retained such speed that it could be over a target and gone again before enemy gunners could fully react. Pilots flew so low they often returned to base with tree branches caught in their landing gear and telephone wires wrapped around their propellers. By April 1944, the 8th Air Force gave equal value and equal credit for German planes destroyed on the ground as for those blown out of the air. Thunderbolts began systematic attacks on German airfields across occupied France. On April 15th, the 56th Fighter Group scored more ground kills than air kills. Hub Zemke himself destroyed 3 Heinkel, 111 bombers parked at Flensburg Airdrome. The Germans began to realize that daylight movement was becoming suicidal, but they still hadn't grasped the full scope of what was coming. June 6th, 1944. D-Day. As dawn broke over Normandy, over 500 P-47s provided air cover for the invasion, creating an impenetrable umbrella over the beaches. German fighters attempting to reach the landing zones were massacred. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of Jagdgeschwader 2 was one of only 3 German pilots to reach the beaches that day. He reported that the sky belonged to the Americans. Thunderbolts were stacked from sea level to 30,000 feet. We tried to break through at dawn. 12 fighters from our grouper. I was the only one to return. The P-47s were waiting at every altitude. You couldn't climb over them, couldn't dive under them. Their guns turned our fighters into aluminum rain. But D-Day itself was almost anticlimactic. The real devastation began in the days and weeks that followed, when Thunderbolts turned their attention to German ground forces trying to respond to the invasion. Major Francis Gabreski, who would become America's top ace in Europe, led the 56th Fighter Group's missions over the invasion beaches. He recalled seeing the English Channel literally covered with ships between England and France. It was one of the most spectacular sights I have ever seen. A massive demonstration of power. When the Allies began to push inland, they had fighter cover on call. Orbiting at 3,500 feet, Thunderbolts swooped down to rake German trucks, trains and troop columns with their .850 caliber Brownings. The 50 Fighter Bomber Group's daily action report from June 8th gives a sense of the pace of activity. One squadron comprised of 16 P-47Ds took off on a dive bombing mission at 13:56 hours, June 8th, 1944. Good results were claimed. At Cerisy-la-Forêt, a tank column of 12 plus was attacked at 14:40 hours, and many were left burning and demolished. About 30 bombs were dropped on these tanks, and they were strafed as well. A direct hit was made on a half-track at road intersection south of Cerisy-le-Ford and left a complete wreck. 18 bombs were dropped on a hutment area near Forêt-des-Biards. An area was then strafed. This was just one squadron on one day. Across Normandy, hundreds of Thunderbolts were conducting similar missions continuously. The psychological impact on German troops was devastating. Without control of the air, German forces were not free to move on the ground. Photographs taken in France in the summer of 1944 show Wehrmacht soldiers anxiously scanning the skies for attackers. For citizens of Germany, the drone of heavy bombers over their cities was terrifying. But for Wehrmacht troops opposing the D-Day landings, it was the roar of P-47s coming in at treetop level, with guns and rockets ablaze that struck fear in their hearts. The Thunderbolt's weapons battery was unlike anything German forces had faced. The standard combat load mixed armor-piercing incendiary, tracer, and standard ball ammunition in patterns designed to both destroy and ignite. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds used a delayed action fuse that ensured penetration before detonation. The incendiary compound burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite aluminum structure and fuel tanks. In ground attack, the armor-piercing ammunition proved devastatingly effective against lightly armoured German vehicles, penetrating thin-skinned transports and causing their fuel tanks to explode. By late June, the P-47 had evolved beyond just machine guns. Mid-production versions could carry 1,000-pound bombs and rockets under their wings. The last versions of the P-47D could carry 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, known as Holy Moses. Each rocket had the impact of a 105mm artillery shell. Though they were hard to aim accurately, and only effective against large targets, they added another dimension of terror to German ground forces. Thunderbolts could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, a bomb load equal to early war medium bombers. The pace of air operations remained intense throughout the Normandy campaign. On July 29th, the 3 P-47 squadrons of the 50th Fighter Bomber Group flew a total of 23 missions. At the cost of 3 aircraft lost to flak and 3 others damaged, the group's pilots reported destroying 46 tanks, more than 80 other vehicles, 8 horse-drawn guns, many buildings, and an anti-aircraft gun, as well as killing an estimated 50 German troops. This was one group on one day. The cumulative effect across all Thunderbolt units was staggering. July 29th, 1944, Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy. In the vicinity of Rancy, the 405th Fighter Group discovered a German column trapped between Rancy and Saint-Denis-le-Vêtu by elements of the US 2nd and 3rd Armoured Divisions. The group attacked this column from 15:10 hours to 21:40 hours, 6.5 hours of continuous attacks. Ground investigations after the battle found 66 tanks, 204 vehicles and 11 guns destroyed in this single attack. The German soldiers who survived described it as hell from above. There was no escape, no cover, no reprieve. The Thunderbolts came in waves, each pass leaving more burning wreckage. A desperate German counterattack in early August attempted to split the Allied front in two at Mortagne, a town close to the Normandy-Brittany border. Intensive British Typhoon and US P-47 attacks, coupled with resolute resistance on the ground, quickly ended the advance. Generalleutnant Heinrich von Luttwitz, commander of the 2nd Panzer Division, recalled morosely that his panzers made good progress until Allied fighter bombers swooped out of the sky. From that moment his offensive was doomed. Daily, fighter-bomber pilots whittled away at the Wehrmacht. On August 8th, they claimed the destruction of 47 tanks and 122 other motor vehicles. On August 12th, they destroyed or damaged an estimated 350 locomotives and over 3,000 rail cars, transports and wagons, together with nearly 800 other vehicles and 9 oil barges. Brigadier General Francis Griswold reported, "It was a big day." The statistics from D-Day to VE Day paint a picture of systematic destruction. Thunderbolt pilots claimed to have destroyed 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armoured fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. These numbers represent the backbone of German logistics in Western Europe. Without trains, trucks, and fuel, the Wehrmacht couldn't supply its armies. Without the ability to move in daylight, German commanders couldn't respond to Allied advances. The P-47 had effectively paralysed the German war machine. But beyond the numbers, it was the psychological impact that truly broke the German will to resist. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign, experienced P-47 ground attacks firsthand. They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces. The sound was terrifying. Engines roaring, rockets screaming. Then the hammer of those heavy machine guns, a column of our trucks, simply ceased to exist. 20 vehicles transformed into burning wreckage in one pass. The psychological effect on the men was devastating. They called them Jabos, fighter bombers. But these were something beyond that. They were flying artillery with the accuracy of snipers. German forces tried everything to counter the Thunderbolt threat. They reinforced vehicle armour. They deployed more anti-aircraft guns. They developed new camouflage techniques. They moved only at night. Nothing worked. The P-47's combination of speed, armour and firepower made them nearly unstoppable. Even the feared 88mm flak guns struggled to track the fast-moving fighters at low altitude. Strafing was more dangerous than aerial combat. A strafer was usually in danger from ground weapons ranging from pistols to 88s throughout an attack run, and even a single rifle bullet could cripple a system or kill a pilot. But P-47s were the least vulnerable of the Allied fighter bombers. They had no liquid cooling plumbing or radiators that might be disastrously holed. The big Pratt & Whitney radial was a 2,400-pound steel and aluminum shield against frontal fire. The stories of P-47 survival were legendary. Lieutenant Edwin Wright of the 404th Fighter Group had completed 39 missions by October 1944 and had been hit by flak 6 times. On one mission, his propeller took a direct hit that left an 8-inch hole in one blade. If the damage had been an inch and a half over on either side, the blade would have severed, and Wright would have been brought down. His fellow pilots dubbed him lucky. He ultimately completed 88 missions in Thunderbolts during the war. The final phases of the Normandy campaign saw Thunderbolts used in increasingly innovative ways. A 19th Tactical Air Command report from the assault on Brest described how in the final phases of the assault, fighter bombers were directed to attack individual houses which were obstructing progress of the ground attack, in effect street fighting with P-47s. This was precision close air support that no one had imagined possible at the start of the war. So feared were Allied fighter bombers that when General Major Botho Elster surrendered his entire command of 20,000 troops to the advancing Americans, he pointedly surrendered not to the 9th Army's general, but to the General's Army Air Force's representative. This symbolic act demonstrated how completely air power had dominated the battlefield. German commanders recognized that they had been defeated as much by aircraft as by ground forces. Altogether, the Wehrmacht lost thousands of tanks, armoured cars, mobile artillery and other transports in France. Units fortunate enough to withdraw from Normandy did so with few, and in some cases no mechanised vehicles, returning on foot or by horse-drawn wagon. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army had effectively ceased to exist. 25 out of 38 German divisions had been utterly destroyed. The rest had been reduced to shattered remnants. Allied fighter bombers took a heavy toll of German tanks, vehicles and horse-drawn transport during the retreat. The roads from Normandy toward the German border were littered with destroyed and abandoned equipment. American fighter bombers, primarily the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, mounting 850 caliber machine guns and capable of carrying 500 and 1,000-pound bombs, ranged in front of tank formations in what became known as armoured column cover. Air liaison officers riding in tanks equipped with VHF radios could communicate with aircraft overhead, requesting attacks on targets and receiving reports of enemy forces ahead. Together, the air-ground team, particularly in Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army and Brigadier General Otto Wayland's 19th Tactical Air Command, formed a model of air-ground cooperation. The 19th TAC screened Patton's right flank along the Loire Valley as they raced deeper into France. The rapid breakout from the Normandy beachhead and subsequent drive across France was made possible in large part by the Thunderbolt's dominance of the battlefield. German forces couldn't mass for counterattacks without being spotted and destroyed from the air. They couldn't resupply their forward units in daylight. They couldn't retreat without suffering catastrophic losses. The P-47 had turned the traditional advantages of defensive warfare on its head. Instead of the defender having superior lines of communication and supply, the Germans found themselves trapped in fortified positions that became targets for air attack. The transformation in German attitudes toward the P-47 was complete by late 1944. In March 1945, Oberstleutnant Josef Priller, the same pilot who had mocked the P-47s as pregnant cows 2 years earlier, was interviewed by German propaganda officials. His statement was deemed too demoralizing for publication. "The Thunderbolt is the best fighter bomber ever built. Its firepower is unprecedented. Weapons that never jam, never overheat, never run out of ammunition in normal combat. It carries bombs like a medium bomber, fires rockets like artillery, and fights like a fighter when needed." But beyond the machine is what it represents. Unlimited American production. They lose 10, they build 20. We lose 1, it's gone forever. Their pilots arrive better trained than our instructors. They have fuel for training, ammunition for practice, spare parts for everything. We have nothing but courage. And courage without resources is just delayed defeat. We laughed at them in 1943. We're not laughing now. When you hear those guns, you know death has come calling. The sound haunts us. Mechanical, precise, unstoppable. Like everything American, it's about overwhelming material superiority. They didn't beat us through better tactics or braver pilots. They buried us under an avalanche of steel and lead. The production numbers tell the story. Republic Aviation produced 15,683 P-47s during the war, more than any other American fighter. At peak production, the Farmingdale factory on Long Island completed 1 Thunderbolt every hour around the clock. The Evansville plant in Indiana was producing 500 aircraft per month by 1944. Each P-47D required 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, 2,000 pounds of aluminum, and 300 pounds of rubber. Yet American workers, many of them women who had never seen an aircraft before Pearl Harbor, assembled these complex machines with precision that exceeded peacetime standards. The ammunition production was equally staggering. Each P-47 sortie required 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. With hundreds of Thunderbolts flying daily missions, ammunition consumption exceeded 10 million rounds per month by mid-1944. The Lake City Arsenal in Missouri produced 30 million rounds monthly. Each cartridge was manufactured to tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch, ensuring reliable feeding through the synchronized gun mechanisms. The fuel consumption was enormous. Each Thunderbolt burned 100 gallons per hour in normal flight, up to 300 gallons in combat. The 9th Air Force alone consumed over 25 million gallons of aviation fuel monthly by late 1944. All of it was shipped across the Atlantic in tankers that were themselves products of American mass production. This industrial capacity was something the Germans simply couldn't match. Major George Brooking's response to a captured German pilot who taunted him about destroyed aircraft became legendary. The German pointed at burning Thunderbolts on an airfield and asked, "What do you think of that?" Brooking pointed to the flight line where ground crews were already pushing damaged aircraft aside. By tomorrow, we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots? Beyond just aircraft production, the American training pipeline was producing 30,000 pilots annually by 1944. Each P-47 pilot received a minimum of 400 hours of flight training before entering combat, including 100 hours in advanced fighters. German pilots, by contrast, were entering combat with less than 100 hours total time by war's end. Lieutenant Eugene Roberts, arriving in England in September 1944, exemplified the American training advantage. I had 420 hours in my logbook, including 75 hours in the P-47. I'd fired at towed targets, practiced deflection shooting, studied gun camera film from actual combat. My first mission, I knew exactly what to do. The German pilot I faced couldn't have had half my experience. It wasn't even a fair fight. The P-47 didn't just defeat German ground forces through firepower, it defeated them through systematic, relentless application of overwhelming industrial and technological superiority. Every destroyed locomotive meant supplies couldn't reach the front. Every destroyed truck meant troops couldn't be repositioned. Every destroyed tank meant offensive operations became impossible. The cumulative effect was the paralysis of the Wehrmacht's operational capabilities in Western Europe. The Thunderbolt's impact extended beyond Europe. In the Pacific Theatre, the 348th Fighter Group operating from New Guinea discovered that the P-47's qualities were perfectly suited to the vast distances and harsh conditions. Colonel Neil Kirby led 4 P-47s against 40 Japanese aircraft over Wewak, shooting down 6 enemy planes himself in a single mission, earning him the Medal of Honor. Japanese pilots were unprepared for the Thunderbolt's combination of firepower and durability. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai later wrote that they called them monsters. Our 20mm cannon, which could destroy a P-40 with a few hits, seemed to have no effect. I put dozens of rounds into one Thunderbolt and watched it fly away. Their return fire was terrifying, streams of heavy bullets that tore aircraft apart. But it was in the ground attack role in Europe where the P-47 truly earned its reputation. The aircraft that German pilots had laughed at in April 1943 had become by May 1945 the most feared weapon in the Allied arsenal. The transformation took less than 2 years, but in that time, 8 synchronized Browning machine guns rewrote the rules of ground warfare. German forces had fought courageously, often brilliantly, against overwhelming odds, but courage and tactical skill couldn't overcome the systematic destruction of their logistical infrastructure. When German generals assessed why they lost in the West, air power topped the list, and when they identified which aircraft had been most devastating, the P-47 Thunderbolt was always mentioned first. Feldwebel Klaus Brechender, one of the last German pilots trained in 1945, flew exactly 1 combat mission before the war ended. His encounter with P-47s over Leipzig lasted 12 seconds. I saw them diving from above, 4 Thunderbolts in perfect formation. I tried to turn, but they were too fast. The leader fired from 500 meters. My aircraft shook like it was hit by sledgehammers. The engine exploded, the wings separated, I barely escaped. In the parachute, I watched them destroy my entire staff. 6 fighters gone in under a minute. The sky rained burning aluminum and bodies. The final statistics defy comprehension. In Europe, 3,752 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. 3,315 aircraft destroyed on the ground. 86,000 railway cars destroyed. 9,000 locomotives destroyed. 6,000 armoured fighting vehicles destroyed, 68,000 trucks destroyed, 60,000 horse-drawn vehicles destroyed. The 9th Air Force alone, primarily equipped with P-47s, flew 213,873 combat sorties, dropped 100 to 20,000 tons of bombs, fired 135 million rounds of ammunition, and launched 60,000 rockets. The Thunderbolt units achieved a 4.6 to 1 kill ratio in aerial combat while maintaining the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter bomber. These numbers represented the systematic dismantling of German military capability in Western Europe. Every statistic represented German soldiers who couldn't be resupplied, German reinforcements that never reached the front, German counterattacks that never materialized. The P-47 had turned the theoretical advantage of interior lines and defensive positions into a death trap. German forces couldn't concentrate without being attacked. They couldn't disperse without losing cohesion. They couldn't advance without being spotted. They couldn't retreat without being massacred. At war's end, captured German intelligence files showed the complete reversal of opinion about the Thunderbolt. April 1943 assessment. Large unmaneuverable fighter, inferior to German types in all performance parameters, except dive speed. Machine gun armament insufficient against cannon-armed fighters. Assessment minimal threat. December 1943 assessment. Exceptional high-altitude performance, extreme structural strength, firepower increasingly problematic, pilots showing improved tactics, assessment significant threat above 25,000 feet. June 1944 assessment. Dominant fighter-bomber, superior to all German types above 20,000 feet. Firepower devastating against all target types. Structural strength makes shoot-down extremely difficult. Assessment critical threat at all altitudes. March 1945 assessment. Best fighter-bomber of the war. Combination of firepower, durability, and performance unmatched. Pilot quality exceptional. Assessment unsurvivable in direct engagement. In 1985, at a reunion of German and American fighter pilots in Phoenix, Arizona, former adversaries met in peace. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, former head of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, was asked about the P-47. "We made a terrible mistake in 1943. We saw this big heavy fighter and laughed. The Americans don't understand air combat, we said. They built a bomber and called it a fighter. We were the ones who didn't understand. The Americans didn't try to build a European fighter. They built an American one, designed around production, firepower, and survivability. They understood that in a war of attrition, the plane that could take punishment and deliver devastating firepower would win. They were right. The first time I flew a captured P-47 after the war, I understood everything. The power was incredible. It climbed like it was falling upward. But what really impressed me was realizing that America built over 15,000 of these complex machines while fighting a two-ocean war. Each one required an engine more complex than anything Germany produced. Yet they built them faster than we could build simple fighters. That's when I knew we never had a chance. Those guns. We called them Roosevelt's piano because of the sound they made. Once you heard that sound, you never forgot it. Many of my friends heard it for the last time. The P-47 didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it destroyed it. The Republic P-47, Thunderbolt remains the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever mass-produced. Its empty weight of 10,000 pounds exceeded the gross weight of some twin-engine fighters. Its engine produced more power than entire bomber formations from the previous war. Its weapons delivered more firepower than a squad of infantry. Yet it was built by the thousands, flown by kids barely out of high school, and maintained under combat conditions by mechanics who learned their trade in weeks. German pilots had laughed at the ungainly American fighter in April 1943. They called them flying milk bottles, fat targets, pregnant cows. By May 1945, there were no German pilots left to laugh. The thunder had spoken. The ground forces of the Wehrmacht lay in ruins, and the sky belonged to America. The devastation wrought by P-47s on German ground forces created a cascading effect that military historians would study for decades. The loss of transportation infrastructure didn't just prevent supplies from reaching the front. It fundamentally altered how the Wehrmacht could wage war. German commanders found themselves fighting a 20th century conflict with 19th century logistics. Without trucks and trains, they relied increasingly on horse-drawn wagons. Without fuel, tanks became stationary pillboxes. Without the ability to maneuver, tactical brilliance became irrelevant. General Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B in France, sent increasingly desperate reports to Berlin throughout June and July 1944. In one message dated June 10th, just 4 days after D-Day, Rommel wrote that the enemy has complete command of the air over the battle area and up to about 100 kilometers behind the front. Almost all transportation on roads, tracks and open country is under continual attack by day and by night. Movement by day is entirely impossible. The Luftwaffe's failure to provide adequate air cover meant that Rommel's forces were effectively blind. German reconnaissance aircraft couldn't operate in daylight without being shot down. Allied aircraft, particularly P-47s with their long loiter time, could observe every German movement and either attack directly or call in artillery strikes. The psychological impact on German troops manifested in ways that went beyond simple fear. Medical officers at field hospitals began reporting a new condition they called jabbo fever. Soldiers would develop physical symptoms, trembling, nausea, inability to concentrate, whenever P-47s were reported in the area. Veterans who had fought on the Eastern Front against Soviet aircraft described the American fighter bombers as infinitely more terrifying. On the Eastern Front you had moments of safety. Aircraft would attack, then leave to refuel and rearm. Against the Americans there was no respite. As soon as one formation left, another arrived. The sky was never empty. The Germans attempted numerous countermeasures, all of which proved inadequate. They experimented with decoy vehicles made from wood and canvas, hoping to waste American ammunition on fake targets. P-47 pilots quickly learned to identify decoys by their lack of track marks and the absence of heat shimmer from engines. They developed smokescreen techniques, burning wet straw and oil to create artificial fog that would conceal troop movements. Thunderbolt pilots simply waited for the smoke to clear or attacked the source of the smoke, correctly assuming that anything worth hiding was worth destroying. Anti-aircraft defences were increased dramatically. By August 1944, German forces in France had more anti-aircraft guns per square kilometre than at any other point in the war. But the P-47's tactics made traditional flak defence largely ineffective. By diving from 15,000 feet and releasing weapons at high speed, Thunderbolt pilots minimised their exposure to ground fire. The few seconds they spent in effective flak range made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Moreover, the P-47 could absorb damage that would destroy other aircraft. Multiple instances were recorded of Thunderbolts returning to base with flak damage that should have been fatal: holes in wings, damaged control surfaces, shrapnel through the engine cowling, yet they continued flying. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Bradley of the 350th Fighter Group described a mission over the Falaise Gap in August 1944 that exemplified both the danger and effectiveness of ground attack missions. We came in at 10,000 feet, spotted a German column trying to escape through the gap. Must have been 200 vehicles, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, all jammed together on a narrow road with hedgerows on both sides. Perfect target. We rolled in, 4 ships in my flight. The flak was intense. You could see the black puffs filling the air like a wall. I pickled my bombs at 4,000 feet, pulled up hard, felt the aircraft shudder as something hit us, kept climbing, looked back and road was gone, just smoke and fire. We made 3 more passes, strafing. By the time we left, nothing was moving. My wingman counted 67 vehicles destroyed or damaged, cost us 1 aircraft. Pilot bailed out safely. The Falaise Gap, also known as the Falaise Pocket, became the ultimate demonstration of what concentrated air power could do to trapped ground forces. Between August 12th and August 21st, 1944, Allied forces encircled the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army in a pocket near the town of Falaise. As German forces attempted to escape through a narrow gap, they were subjected to the most intensive air attacks of the war. P-47s from multiple groups took turns attacking the trapped columns in what pilots described as a turkey shoot. The carnage was unlike anything seen before in warfare. Pilots reported that you couldn't see the roads anymore, just burning vehicles. The smoke rose to 10,000 feet. We'd make a pass, climb back up, and by the time we turned around for another run, different targets were burning. It was like shooting fish in a barrel, except the fish were shooting back with everything they had. The roads through the Falaise Gap became known as the Corridor of Death. Post-battle assessment counted thousands of destroyed vehicles. Exact numbers were impossible to determine because many vehicles had been completely incinerated, their wreckage indistinguishable from the surrounding debris. German survivors of Falaise described an apocalyptic landscape. SS Sturmbannführer Max Wünsche, who commanded a battalion in the 12th SS Panzer Division, recalled that artillery and fighter bomber attacks never ceased. The roads were choked with burning vehicles, wounded men and horses screaming, dead bodies everywhere. The smell of burning fuel and flesh was overwhelming. We abandoned everything and fled on foot. Most of my men never made it out. Those who did were broken, not just physically, but mentally. They had seen the end of the German army in France. The statistics from the Normandy campaign reveal the scale of destruction. Between D-Day and the end of August 1944, German forces in France lost approximately 1,500 tanks and assault guns, 20,000 other vehicles, and 1,500 artillery pieces. While ground combat accounted for some of these losses, Post-war analysis by US Army historians concluded that between 40 and 60% of German equipment losses in France were attributable to air attack, primarily by fighter bombers. The P-47, being the most numerous Allied fighter bomber, was responsible for the majority of this destruction. The impact extended beyond equipment to personnel. German casualty reports from the Normandy campaign show an unusually high proportion of wounds from strafing and bombing compared to artillery and small arms fire. Field hospitals reported that wounds from 50 caliber machine gun fire were particularly devastating. The heavy bullets travelling at supersonic speeds created massive wound channels and transferred enormous kinetic energy. Soldiers hit by 50 caliber fire rarely survived long enough to reach medical care. One German medical officer wrote that American machine gun fire from aircraft created wounds we had never seen before. The bullets don't just penetrate, they destroy everything in their path. A hit to an extremity often requires amputation. A torso hit is invariably fatal. As Allied forces broke out of Normandy and began their race across France, the P-47's role evolved again. With German forces in full retreat, Thunderbolt squadrons began operating as flying cavalry, ranging far ahead of advancing ground forces to interdict German withdrawal routes. The 366th Fighter Group, known as the Gunfighters, pioneered these deep penetration missions. Flying from advanced airstrips just behind the front lines, P-47s would launch at dawn, fly 200 miles into German-held territory, spend an hour hunting for targets, then return. These missions required precise navigation, careful fuel management, and iron nerves. A mechanical failure or combat damage deep behind enemy lines meant certain capture or death. Captain Charles Johnson of the 366th described these missions as the most satisfying flying of the war. We'd come in low, maybe 500 feet, following roads and rail lines. Anything that moved was fair game. Locomotives were priority targets because destroying them blocked entire rail lines. We'd hit the engine with armour-piercing rounds, watch the boiler explode, steam everywhere. Then we'd work over the cars behind it. Tanker cars were spectacular. They'd go up like volcanoes, sending flames hundreds of feet into the air. After we'd exhausted our ammunition, we'd climb back up, navigate home, land, and do it again in the afternoon. The Germans responded to these deep penetration raids by attempting to set ambushes. They would position heavy flak guns along known approach routes, camouflaged and waiting for Thunderbolts to fly into range. These ambushes claimed several aircraft, but American pilots quickly adapted. They varied their routes, approached from different directions, and developed an instinct for spotting flak positions. Lieutenant James Howard, who survived 65 missions, explained that you learn to read the terrain. Flak guns need clear fields of fire and good access roads. You'd look for those indicators. A clearing in a forest near a major road, probably flak. A barn with fresh earth around it, definitely flak. We'd mark these positions on our maps and either avoid them or attack them with bombs before strafing other targets in the area. By September 1944, as Allied forces approached the German border, the nature of ground attack missions changed again. German forces were now fighting on their own soil, with better supply lines and stronger defences. The easy targets of the French retreat were gone, replaced by well-dug-in positions with concentrated anti-aircraft defences. P-47 losses began to climb. September and October 1944 saw some of the highest loss rates of the entire campaign, but the missions continued because the strategic impact was undeniable. Every destroyed truck, every cratered road, every demolished bridge delayed German reinforcements and prevented the Wehrmacht from establishing stable defensive lines. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 demonstrated both the vulnerability and the critical importance of air power. When the Germans launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes, they achieved significant initial success, partly because bad weather grounded Allied aircraft. For nearly a week, low clouds and snow prevented P-47s from operating. German armoured columns advanced rapidly, recapturing territory and threatening to split the Allied front. American ground forces fought desperately to contain the breakthrough, but without air support they struggled against the German panzers. Then, on December the 23rd, the weather cleared. General George Patton's Third Army, racing north to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne, was supported by the 19th Tactical Air Command's P-47s. On December the 24th, Christmas Eve, Over 400 Thunderbolts flew continuous missions against German forces in the Ardennes. The impact was immediate and devastating. German columns that had been advancing steadily for a week were suddenly immobilized. Destroyed vehicles blocked roads. Fuel trucks went up in flames, leaving panzers stranded without gasoline. Supply columns were shredded before they could reach forward units. German commanders later identified December 23rd and 24th as the turning point of the Battle of the Bulge. Not because of any single ground engagement, but because the return of Allied air power made continued offensive operations impossible. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, whose battle group had spearheaded the German advance, found his column trapped near Stoumont with no fuel and no supplies. He abandoned his vehicles and led his men out on foot. In his post-war interrogation, Peiper stated flatly that the American aircraft destroyed our offensive. Once they could fly again, we were finished. The Thunderbolt's contribution to halting the Bulge offensive earned recognition at the highest levels. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, sent a message to the Air Forces stating that the air effort was decisive. General Patton, never one to praise unnecessarily, told his staff that those P-47 boys saved our asses. Without them, we'd still be fighting in the Ardennes. The Thunderbolt had proven that control of the air translated directly into control of the ground. As Allied forces pushed into Germany itself in early 1940, 5 P-47 missions took on an increasingly interdictory role. With German industry still producing weapons, Allied air power focused on preventing those weapons from reaching the front. Railroad marshalling yards, road junctions and bridges became priority targets. The P-47, with its ability to deliver both bombs and strafing fire, was ideal for these missions. A typical mission might involve dive bombing a bridge, then strafing any vehicles trapped on either side. The destruction of German transportation networks had effects beyond immediate military impact. Civilian refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet army from the east clogged the same roads that German military forces needed for retreat and resupply. P-47 pilots faced difficult decisions about attacking mixed columns of military and civilian vehicles. Official policy was to attack only clearly military targets, but in the chaos of the war's final months, the distinction was often unclear. Some pilots reported feeling sick after discovering that columns they had attacked included refugees. Others rationalized that anything moving supplies west was supporting the German war effort. The moral ambiguity of strategic air power became intensely personal for pilots flying ground attack missions. Technical innovations continued to improve the P-47's effectiveness throughout 1945. The introduction of napalm jellied gasoline in drop tanks gave Thunderbolts an incendiary weapon that was particularly effective against area targets like rail yards and supply depots. Napalm would splash over a wide area and burn intensely, destroying everything within the impact zone. The psychological effect on German troops was profound. Soldiers reported that the screaming sound of a napalm tank falling, followed by the massive fireball and intense heat, was more terrifying than high explosive bombs. Forward air controllers, officers on the ground with radios who could communicate directly with orbiting aircraft, became increasingly common in the final months of the war. These FACs could identify targets that were invisible from the air, such as camouflaged gun positions or troops in buildings, and direct P-47 strikes with precision. The coordination between ground and air forces reached a level of sophistication that would serve as a model for future conflicts. Lieutenant Thomas Mitchell, an FAC with the First Army, described the system as beautifully simple. I'd spot a target, call in the Thunderbolts, talk them onto the target and watch it disappear. Usually took less than 10 minutes from identification to destruction. The final statistics of P-47 operations in Europe are almost incomprehensible in their magnitude. From their combat debut in April 1943 to VE Day in May 1945, Thunderbolts flew over 546,000 combat sorties. They dropped 132,000 tons of bombs and fired 135 million rounds of ammunition. The 9th Air Force, which operated primarily in the ground attack role, accounted for the majority of these numbers. Individual pilot achievements were equally remarkable. Several P-47 pilots exceeded 100 combat missions. Many flew more than 200 missions. The sortie rate, the number of missions per pilot, exceeded that of any other Allied aircraft type. But beyond the numbers, it was the consistent, relentless application of air power that broke the Wehrmacht's ability to wage mobile warfare. German commanders learned that any concentration of forces would be attacked from the air. Any movement in daylight was suicidal. Any supply column was vulnerable. The traditional advantages of defensive warfare, interior lines of communication, the ability to shift reserves rapidly, and concentrated fire support all evaporated when the enemy owned the sky. The P-47 had turned the German army into a static force, tied to their positions, unable to maneuver, waiting for the inevitable Allied advance. German tactical doctrine evolved throughout the war to cope with Allied air superiority, but none of the solutions were adequate. Dispersal of forces reduced the effectiveness of air attack, but also reduced combat power and made command and control nearly impossible. Movement at night avoided air attack but was slow, exhausting, and vulnerable to accidents and navigation errors. Camouflage and concealment worked only if perfect. A single vehicle that failed to properly camouflage, a fire that produced visible smoke, or a unit that broke radio silence could bring P-47s down on an entire formation. Some German units developed innovative countermeasures. Flak batteries learned to hold their fire until Allied aircraft were committed to an attack run, hoping to achieve surprise. Some success was achieved with this tactic, but it required discipline and nerve. Gunners had to watch Thunderbolts diving toward them with guns blazing, and wait until the optimal moment to return fire. Not all flak crews could maintain that discipline. Many opened fire too early, revealing their positions and allowing P-47 pilots to break off and attack from a different direction. The Germans also experimented with heavily armoured vehicles specifically designed to survive air attack. The Berg Panther, a recovery vehicle based on the Panther tank chassis, had thick enough armour to resist 50 caliber fire from most angles. But these specialised vehicles were few in number and couldn't protect the trucks, half-tracks and horse-drawn wagons that made up the bulk of German logistics. The fundamental problem remained unsolvable. The Wehrmacht needed mobility to fight effectively, but any mobile forces were vulnerable to air attack. By April 1945, German resistance in the West was collapsing, not because of lack of courage or poor tactics, but because the Wehrmacht no longer had the physical means to resist. Units were isolated and out of supply. Armoured divisions had no fuel. Infantry divisions had no ammunition. Artillery had no shells, all because the transportation network that sustained them had been systematically destroyed over the previous year. The P-47 had accomplished what ground forces alone could never achieve. It had cut the sinews of war, leaving the German army paralysed and helpless. The contrast with the Eastern Front was instructive. In the East, the Soviets employed massive artillery bombardments and overwhelming numerical superiority to defeat German forces. Battles lasted weeks and consumed hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. In the West, Allied forces advanced rapidly with relatively light casualties, not because they were fighting inferior German troops, but because those troops lacked the supplies and mobility to mount effective resistance. Air power had changed the fundamental calculus of warfare. The final P-47 missions of the war in Europe were flown in early May 1945. With German forces in full collapse, pilots reported that finding targets became difficult. Roads that had once been packed with military traffic were empty. Rail lines had been bombed so many times that nothing moved on them. The few remaining German units were trying to surrender to American forces rather than continue fighting. Some pilots felt almost sorry for the enemy soldiers they encountered. These weren't the confident Wehrmacht troops of 1943. These were exhausted, starved, demoralised men who wanted only to survive until they could go home. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. In the celebrations that followed, P-47 pilots recognised that their contribution, while less glamorous than the achievements of bomber crews or long-range escorts, had been fundamental to Allied victory. They had destroyed the German army's ability to fight. They had made it impossible for Germany to sustain military operations. They had proven that control of the air was not just an advantage, but a prerequisite for victory in modern warfare. Post-war assessments by military historians universally recognised the P-47's ground attack role as decisive. British historian John Terraine wrote that the systematic destruction of German transportation by Allied fighter bombers, predominantly the P-47 Thunderbolt, was as important to the defeat of Germany as the strategic bombing campaign or any ground offensive. The Germans could replace destroyed tanks and guns. They could not replace the entire transportation infrastructure of Western Europe. American historian Stephen Ambrose noted that Allied soldiers advancing through France and Germany frequently commented on the wreckage left by air attacks. Destroyed vehicles lined every road. Bridges lay in ruins. Rail yards were tangles of twisted metal. The physical evidence of air power's impact was visible everywhere. The soldiers advancing on the ground knew that they owed their relatively light casualties to the aircraft that had cleared the path ahead of them. German military leaders, interviewed after the war, were unanimous in identifying air power as the decisive factor in their defeat in the West. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who commanded German forces in the West for much of the war, stated that the Allied air forces were the greatest single factor in the German defeat. We could counter the tanks, we could counter the artillery, we could not counter the aircraft. They were everywhere, all the time, and there was nothing we could do to stop them. General Günther Blumentritt, von Rundstedt's chief of staff, was more specific. The American P-47 was the weapon we feared most. Its guns could destroy anything on the battlefield. Its armour made it nearly impossible to shoot down with light flak. Its endurance meant it was always overhead. When you heard that sound, the deep roar of those big engines, you knew that death was coming, and there was nowhere to hide. The Republic P-47, Thunderbolt entered combat as a high-altitude interceptor, was mocked by its enemies as ungainly and ineffective, and ended the war as the most successful ground attack aircraft in history. The transformation was made possible by the aircraft's fundamental characteristics: extreme durability, overwhelming firepower, and mass production. These were not the traditional virtues of fighter aircraft. European fighters prized maneuverability and climb rate. Japanese fighters emphasized low weight and range. The P-47 emphasized none of these things. Instead, it was built around American industrial philosophy. If you need to kill something, shoot it with enough bullets that success is guaranteed. If you need to survive, build it strong enough that nothing can kill it. If you need enough of them, design for production, and build factories that can make one per hour. This philosophy, dismissed by many military experts before the war as crude and unsophisticated, proved devastatingly effective in practice. German and Japanese fighters might be more elegant, more technically refined, more optimized for specific missions. But the P-47 was more effective at the one mission that mattered most: destroying the enemy's ability to wage war. It didn't need to be the most maneuverable or the fastest climbing or the longest ranged. It needed to destroy trucks and trains and tanks and soldiers, and it did that better than any other aircraft in history. The legacy of the P-47 extended beyond World War II. The lessons learned from its ground attack missions influenced aircraft design and tactical doctrine for decades. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, developed in the 1970s, was explicitly designed around the same principles as the P-47: heavy armour, massive, firepower, and the ability to absorb punishment. The close air support doctrine developed by P-47 squadrons in Europe became the template for air-ground cooperation in Korea, Vietnam, and every subsequent conflict. The understanding that air superiority must be exploited through systematic destruction of enemy ground forces and logistics became fundamental to American military doctrine. When the last P-47s were retired from active service in the 1950s, they had earned a reputation as perhaps the most effective combat aircraft of World War II. Not because they had the highest performance or the best kill ratio in air-to-air combat, but because they had fundamentally altered the nature of warfare. They had proven that tactical air power, properly employed, could achieve strategic effects, that destroying logistics and transportation was as important as destroying combat forces, that control of the air translated directly into control of the ground. The P-47 Thunderbolt had ruined the German ground forces, not in a single battle or campaign, but through relentless systematic destruction over 2 years. 8 50-caliber machine guns, firing 100 rounds per second, had torn apart the Wehrmacht's ability to wage war. German soldiers who had survived the Eastern Front, who had endured Soviet artillery barrages and mass tank attacks, stated that nothing was as terrifying as being attacked by P-47s. The clinical precision, the overwhelming firepower, the knowledge that there was no defence and no escape. That was the true terror of the Thunderbolt. In the end, the flying milk bottle that German pilots had mocked in 1943 had become the weapon that ended their war. The sound of Roosevelt's piano, the thunder of those massive radial engines, The hammer of those 8 heavy machine guns, those sounds marked the end of the Wehrmacht's ability to resist. German pilots had underestimated the P-47. They had paid for that mistake with their ground forces, their logistics, and ultimately with the war itself. The thunder had spoken, and its message was written in the wreckage of 15,000 destroyed locomotives, 86,000 destroyed rail cars, and 68,000 destroyed trucks. The P-47 Thunderbolt had not just won battles, it had destroyed an army's ability to fight, and in doing so, it had changed warfare forever.